The fire crackled low in the hearth that October night in 1985, throwing copper light across the wooden walls of the old Victorian house at 442 Briarwood Lane. Outside, the Astoria fog rolled in from the Columbia River, thick as wool swallowing the porch lamp and the cedar trees beyond. Inside, a 78-year-old man sat in a creaking rocking chair, a wool blanket folded over his knees, a brass key resting in the leathered palm of his right hand. The key had turned green with age, the way old copper does, the way old men do. Walter Ashby looked at that key for a long time before he spoke. His grandson Jonah, 12 years old, sat cross-legged on the rug at his feet, hugging a couch cushion to his chest. The boy had been begging for this story since supper. His father had told him once, just once, that Grandpa had stared down the barrel of a Colt 1911 when he was barely 18 years old. The boy had not slept right since. Walter cleared his throat. "Boy," he said, his voice low and steady as a freight train far away. "In the autumn of 1925, I was 18 years old. I stood in the coal cellar of a haunted house in this very town, in this very house we sit in tonight. Behind me were stacks of pure gold bars enough to buy a small kingdom. And in front of me, no more than 5 paces away, leveled at the center of my chest, was the black muzzle of a .45 caliber Colt automatic. The man holding that pistol wanted me dead." Jonah's mouth fell open. Walter set the key down on the side table beside his coffee. "I have never told this story to anyone," he said. "Not your grandmother, not your father, not the priest who married me. But tonight I'm going to tell it to you, because some lessons can only be passed on through a true story." The old man closed his eyes. The fire popped, and the year peeled back like the pages of a Bible that had not been opened in a very long time. The year was 1925. Portland, Oregon. The autumn rains had come early that year, the kind of rain that drove sideways and turned the cobblestones of Burnside Street into black mirrors. Walt Ashby was 18 years old, and he was already a tired man. He worked 9 hours a day at the Pacific Lumber Mill on the east bank of the Willamette River. 12 cents an hour. He had started there at the age of 14 after he quit school to help his mother pay the rent. By 18, his shoulders had broadened from hauling Douglas fir, but his arms were thin, his cheeks hollow, his eyes the color of wet slate. His mother was Margaret Ashby. The neighbors called her Maggie. She washed laundry for the wealthy families up in Portland Heights, the kind of women who wore silk gloves to church and never once met her eyes when she came to collect their dirty linen at the back door. Maggie was 38 years old that autumn, but she looked closer to 50. Grief does that to a woman. She had been married once before, to a young Navy man named Bennett. Maggie had loved him the way poor girls love handsome boys in summer, foolishly and entirely. They had married in secret in the spring of 1906 because Bennett's family in Astoria did not approve of laundresses. Walter had been born in June of 1907, and for the first decade of his life, his father had been a man who came home from the sea once or twice a year smelling of salt and tobacco, his pea coat, damp from the rain. Bennett had worked the whaling boats out of Astoria and later the merchant freighters that ran the Pacific coast. When America entered the Great War in April of 1917, Bennett had enlisted in the United States Navy out of pure patriotism. He had told Maggie he would be back by Christmas. He never came back. The destroyer USS Jacob Jones was torpedoed by a German submarine on the 6th of December 1917 in the coal-black waters off the southern coast of Ireland. 64 American sailors went down with her. Bennett was 23 years old. The telegram arrived 4 weeks later. Walter was 10 years old when he watched his mother read it. He had stood in the kitchen of their little flat on Division Street and watched the paper shake in her hand. He had watched her fall to her knees on the linoleum. He had watched the only world he had known come apart in a single white envelope. That was the year Walt Ashby learned that the world was a hard place that owed him nothing. His mother told him only that his father had been a good sailor who had died for his country. She did not tell him that Bennett's last name was Whitaker. She did not tell him that his father's people lived in a Victorian mansion on a bluff above the Columbia River. She did not tell him that he had a grandfather, a sea captain named Cornelius, who had refused to attend the secret wedding because the bride was a laundress. She gave the boy her own maiden name, Ashby. She buried the truth in a cedar trunk under her bed alongside a single tintype photograph she could not bring herself to destroy. She swore she would carry the secret to her grave. She had her reasons. The Whitaker family had warned her after the wedding that she would never be one of them. They had not come to the funeral when the telegram arrived. They had not sent a letter. They had not sent $1. Maggie had decided in her grief and her anger that her son would never go begging at their door. Walter grew up in a one-bedroom flat above a butcher shop on Division Street. The smell of blood and sawdust came up through the floorboards every morning. He learned to swing a hatchet at the woodpile in the alley by the time he was 7. He learned to fix a leaking pipe by the time he was 9. He learned to fight the bigger boys at the public school by the time he was 11, and he learned to win those fights by the time he was 12. In 1922, when Walter was 15 years old, his mother remarried. The man was Roy Calloway, a veteran of the Great War, 31 years old. Roy had served in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the autumn of 1918, the bloodiest battle in American history. He came home with a glass eye and a tin box of medals and a tremor in his right hand that never quite went away. In the beginning, Roy was kind. He taught Walt how to bait a hook for steelhead trout in the creeks east of the city. He taught the boy how to swing a hatchet properly, how to sharpen a knife on a leather strop, how to whistle through his teeth. For 2 years, Walt called him sir and meant it. Then came 1924. The nightmare started. Roy began drinking bootleg whiskey to quiet the sound of artillery shells inside his skull. Prohibition was the law of the land, but in Portland, a man with the right friends could find a bottle of homemade corn liquor for $0.25 at any back alley speakeasy. Roy found those friends. He found those bottles. And when the whiskey hit his blood, the kindness in him drained out like water through a sieve. He hit Maggie first, then Walt, then the dishes. By the time he was 17, Walt slept with an iron bar under his pillow. He learned to listen for the squeak of the third stair from the top, the one Roy always stepped on when he came home drunk. He learned to be small. He learned to be silent. He learned most of all to wait. It was in the autumn of 1924, when Walt was 17, that he found the photograph. He was rummaging through his mother's old cedar trunk, looking for a winter coat she had promised him. Beneath the mothballs and the folded woolens, his fingers brushed something flat and cold, a tintype. He pulled it out into the gray light of the window. The photograph showed 2 men standing on the front steps of an enormous Victorian house. The older man wore a sea captain's coat, brass buttons gleaming. The younger man wore a Navy uniform, the kind with the high white collar and the round white cap. Behind them, the ocean. Behind the ocean, the long gray line of the Oregon coast. Walt had never been to the coast in his life. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, was written a single line: Bennett and Cornelius. Astoria, summer 1916. Walt knew the name Bennett. It was his father, but he had never seen this picture before, and he did not know the name Cornelius. He did not know that Victorian house. He brought the tintype to the kitchen where his mother was kneading dough for the morning bread. He held it up. He asked her quietly who the second man was. Maggie froze. Her flour-dusted hands hovered above the wooden board. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she snatched the photograph from his hand. She walked to the cedar trunk. She put the picture back. She closed the lid, and she said in a voice that was not her voice, "Don't ever ask me again, son. The past is the past. Leave it buried." That was the only time Walter ever saw his mother truly afraid. He did not understand it then. He would understand it terribly exactly 1 year later. The rain on the morning of October the 12th, 1925, was the kind of cold Pacific rain that gets into a man's bones and stays there. It was Walter's 18th birthday. He came home from the mill at 6 in the evening, his work clothes soaked through his hands raw from the saw. He hoped in the small, foolish way that boys hope that his mother had baked him a cornbread cake. She had done that every year of his life. Every year of his life until that one. When he opened the door of the flat, Roy Calloway was waiting for him. Roy stood in the middle of the front room, swaying gently on the balls of his feet, a half-empty mason jar of corn whiskey in his left hand. His one good eye, the right one, was bloodshot. His glass eye stared somewhere over Walter's shoulder. On the floor at his feet sat a brown burlap sack, the kind they use at the mill to haul sawdust. The sack was lumpy and bulging. "You're a man now, boy," Roy said. The words came out slow and slurred. "This here ain't no charity house. Pick up your sack, walk out, don't come back." Walt's eyes moved past him to the kitchen doorway. There in the shadows stood his mother, Margaret Ashby. Her arms were crossed tight against her chest. Her shoulders were shaking. Her eyes were fixed on the floorboards. She would not look at her son. The room held its breath. "Mama," Walt said, and his voice cracked the way it had cracked when he was 12. Maggie's lips moved. The whisper that came out of her was so small a man could have missed it. "Walter, honey, Roy is right, I'm sorry." There it was, the thing he had feared in his bones for 2 years. His mother had chosen the drunk over her own son. Walt did not cry. He did not shout. He did not curse. He bent down. He picked up the burlap sack. He pulled his cap low over his eyes. He turned and he walked out the door, and he did not look back, not once, not even when he heard his mother begin to weep behind him. That Walter said softly to his grandson 60 years later was the moment a boy died inside me. And another boy harder and quieter and infinitely older was born to take his place. Some wounds, son, never heal. But some of them, if you let them, teach you how to fly. The first night Walter slept under the Burnside Bridge, the temperature dropped to 38 degrees. He wrapped himself in his only spare coat and pressed his back against a concrete pillar, still warm from the day's sun. He did not sleep. He listened to the river. For 22 days, he learned the geography of the lost. He learned which churches served soup on which mornings. The Methodists on Tuesday, the Catholics on Thursday, the Salvation Army any day God provided. He learned which alleys behind the speakeasies had vagrants who would stab a sleeping boy for a pair of shoes. He learned to keep 3 pennies hidden in the lining of his cap and another 3 sewn into the collar of his shirt. He learned to walk fast and look at no one and trust no one and hope for nothing. But on the 11th night of his exile beneath that same Burnside Bridge, he met a man who would change his life. The man was sitting on a homemade wooden cart, the kind with 2 small iron wheels and a leather strap to pull it along. He was missing his right leg from the knee down. The stump was wrapped in oilcloth. He was perhaps 45 years old, though his hair was already ash gray, and his face was the weathered brown of a man who had spent a long time in foreign mud. In his cracked hands, he held a tin harmonica. He was playing a slow, sad Scottish air. The man's name was Archibald Macready. He had been born in Glasgow in 1880. He had come to America with his parents at the age of 15. He had married a girl named Eleanor in the year of 1910. Eleanor had died of tuberculosis in the autumn of 1916, and Archibald, with nothing left to lose, had volunteered for the United States Army at the age of 37, an old man among the doughboys. He had lost his right leg to a German shell at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in September of 1918. The Army had given him a Purple Heart, a Distinguished Service Cross, and a discharge. It had not given him back his leg. Archie looked Walter up and down on that cold November night. He saw the boy's split lip. He saw the wet shoes. He saw the iron in the boy's eyes. He set down the harmonica. "Sit, lad," he said in a Glasgow accent the years had not worn away. "Sit and listen. There are 3 rules a homeless man lives by in this country, and if you learn them tonight, you might live to see Christmas." Walter sat, he listened, and the old soldier began to teach him. "First rule," Archie said, "never sleep in the same place 2 nights running. The rats remember you. The good people remember you. But the bad people remember you longest of all. Move. Change your face. Disappear." Second rule, when you have nothing left in this world, your pride is your last weapon. Don't sell it cheap. A man who keeps his pride keeps his name. A man who keeps his name keeps his soul. Third rule, Archie's voice dropped. "For the love of Jesus Christ, do not touch the bootleg whiskey. It has killed more of my friends than the German guns ever did." He drew a small canvas pouch from inside his coat and showed Walter the contents. A Purple Heart, a Distinguished Service Cross, a bent wedding ring. He told the boy he had been hungry for 3 winters now, and there had been days he could have sold those medals for a hot meal and a warm bed. He never had. He never would. "This here," Archie said, holding up the bent ring, "is the wedding band of Eleanor Macready, who I loved more than my own breath. And these are the medals of better men than me, men who died beside me in the mud. To sell them is a betrayal. There are some things, lad, that a man does not put a price on." Walter listened, and in that long, cold night beneath the Burnside Bridge, the 18-year-old boy began to understand for the first time in his life what dignity actually was. For 11 more days, the 2 of them traveled together. Archie taught Walter where the safe doorways were, where the cruel cops walked their beats, where the kind nuns at St. Stephen's Church served lentil soup on Tuesday mornings. And it was at St. Stephen's on a gray Tuesday in early November that everything began to change. The soup kitchen at St. Stephen's smelled of damp wool and old bread and lentil broth thick with carrots. Walter and Archie sat at a long pine table near the back, hunched over chipped white bowls, eating slowly the way starving men eat when they do not know when the next meal will come. The door opened. The wind brought in a gust of rain, and a man stepped inside who did not belong there. He was perhaps 65 years old. His coat was black wool heavy, an English cut, the kind of coat a banker wore. His hat was a tall black Homburg. In his right hand he carried a walnut walking stick with a silver knob carved with the initials E.T. His mustache was white and trimmed precisely. His eyes, behind small round spectacles, were kind. He looked around the room. He saw the dozens of hungry men and women. He saw the crucifix on the back wall. And then his eyes settled with a small, startled motion on Walter Ashby. He walked across the room, slowly weaving between the tables. Archie watched him come, his good hand drifting toward the sharpened spoon he kept in his sleeve. But Walter held up a finger. The man stopped at their table. He removed his hat. "Forgive the intrusion, son," he said in a voice as soft and old as a leather Bible. "But I believe you might be Walter Ashby. I have been looking for you for 6 weeks." Walter's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. The man introduced himself. His name was Edmund Thornwood. He was a probate attorney, the senior partner of the firm of Thornwood and Sons on Southwest 6th Avenue. He had been hired by the executor of an estate of considerable importance, and the boy he had been searching for the heir was almost certainly Walter himself. He asked very politely whether Walter might come to his office that afternoon to hear the particulars. Walter did not understand most of what the man had said. He looked at Archie. The old soldier nodded once slowly. "Go, lad," Archie murmured. "Some men in fine coats are wolves, but this one I think is a shepherd." Walter went. The office of Thornwood and Sons was on the third floor of a brownstone building, paneled in dark walnut, the walls lined floor to ceiling with leather law books. A small green-shaded desk lamp burned with a kerosene flame. The rain ticked against the window pane. Edmund Thornwood poured Walter a cup of black coffee from a silver pot and placed it in his hands. Walter wrapped his cold fingers around the cup and felt for the first time in 3 weeks warmth. Edmund opened a brown leather folder on his desk. He folded his hands. "Son," he said quietly, "I have a great deal to tell you, and most of it will hurt before it heals. But I would ask you to listen. Will you listen?" Walter nodded. What Edmund Thornwood told him next in that quiet office on a rainy afternoon in November of 1925 undid every story Walter had ever been told about himself. His father's full name had been Bennett Whitaker. Walter had never known the surname. His mother had hidden it. Bennett had been the only son of a wealthy Astoria sea captain named Cornelius Whitaker, a man Walter had never met whose name he did not know. Bennett and Maggie had married in secret in the spring of 1906 at a small Episcopal chapel on Bond Street in Astoria. They had hidden the marriage from the Whitaker family because the Whitakers were proud people and they had not approved. The Whitakers had warned Maggie after the secret wedding that she would never be one of them. When Bennett had died on the Jacob Jones in 1917, the Whitakers had not come to comfort her. Maggie had buried her grief in her son's name under her own maiden surname. She had hidden the photograph in the cedar trunk. She had decided that her boy would never go begging at a Whitaker door. But Cornelius Whitaker had not let the matter rest. After Bennett's death, Cornelius had locked himself away in his Victorian house on the bluff at Astoria and become a recluse. He had let his hair grow long and white. He had stopped going to church. He had let the village children call his home the haunted house and throw rocks at his windows. He had earned each rock, he believed, by being too proud to attend his own son's wedding. But 2 years before his own death, in the summer of 1923, Cornelius had hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to find his grandson. The Pinkertons had found the boy in 3 weeks. Cornelius had taken the train down to Portland on a hot August afternoon. He had stood at the far edge of Pioneer Square. He had watched a 16-year-old boy with his shirt sleeves rolled up help an elderly stranger pick up a dropped parcel of bread. He had watched the boy tip his cap and refuse the woman's offered penny. He had watched with the slow recognition of a heart breaking open his own son's face on his own grandson's shoulders. He had wept on the train all the way home to Astoria. He had begun to write his will the next morning. Cornelius Whitaker had died in August of 1925, 3 months ago. Edmund Thornwood was the executor of his estate, and Cornelius had left every last possession he owned in this world to a single heir, Walter Ashby. Walter set down the coffee cup. His hand was shaking, The room had gone strangely silent, the way rooms do when news arrives that splits a man's life into a before and an after. There is a property, Edmund said to him, a house on the coast at Astoria, Oregon, 442 Briarwood Lane. It is yours, son. The deed will pass to you the moment we file the paperwork. Walter could not speak. A house, walls, a roof, a door that locked. A place where Roy Calloway could never reach him. A place where the rain could not get in. Is there, he managed his voice barely a whisper, is there any money? Edmund Thornwood's face fell. That son is the unfortunate part. Cornelius's bank accounts at Wells Fargo were drained dry years before his passing. We do not know where the funds went. The estate has no liquid assets at all, and there is a debt against the property. $487 in back property taxes owed to Clatsop County. You have 60 days from today to pay it. If you cannot, the county will foreclose and the house will be auctioned on the courthouse steps. $487. In 1925, that was nearly a year's wages for a working man. It might as well have been the moon. Walter sat in that quiet office and felt the warmth he had just begun to feel turn to ice. It was at exactly that moment that the office door swung open. A young man walked in without knocking. He was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a pinstripe suit, cut in the Chicago style, the kind of suit a bootlegger wore to a roadhouse. He had a gold watch on his wrist and dark hair slicked back with pomade in the manner of Rudolph Valentino. His eyes were ringed with shadow. He smelled of cigar smoke. "Brother," he said to Edmund, "I just need the Henderson file, won't be a minute." Edmund's mouth tightened. "Walter, this is my younger brother Charles. Charles, this is Walter Ashby, the Whitaker heir." Charles Thornwood was the son of his father's second marriage, born 35 years after Edmund raised on indulgence and small expectations. He had been the family's late embarrassment from the day he could walk. Edmund had taken him into the firm only because his dying mother had begged it. Edmund had regretted it within a year. Charles stopped in the doorway. He turned. He looked at Walter. His eyes moved up and down the boy, taking in the muddy boots, the threadbare coat, the gaunt cheeks. A small, cold smile crossed his lips. He gave a brief nod. "Pleasure," Charles said in a voice that meant nothing of the kind. Edmund turned to retrieve a folder from the cabinet behind his desk. The moment his back was turned, Charles Thornwood's eyes dropped to the open file on the desk. They locked onto a single line. The estate inventory, real property only, other holdings undetermined. His smile did not move, but behind his eyes something began to calculate. He took the Henderson file. He nodded again at Walter. He left the room. Walter, sitting in the chair, did not see the small shift in Charles's expression. He did not see the predator beneath the silk. But Edmund Thornwood, when he turned back, saw the doorway swinging shut, and a small, worried frown crossed the old lawyer's face. He shook it off. He reached into his own wallet. He took out a $5 bill and pressed it into Walter's palm. "This is from me, son, not from the estate. Take the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway tomorrow morning. The train pulls out of Union Station at 6. It will take you to Astoria by noon. Go and see the house. Decide for yourself what you want to do." Walter looked at the money. He looked at the old lawyer. He nodded. "Walter," Edmund said, and his voice softened. "Cornelius Whitaker was a good man before grief broke him. He lost his only son to that war. He lost his faith in this world. Do not let his legacy turn you into a bitter recluse. Open the house, son. Let the light in." Walter did not understand the last words. Not yet, but he would. That night beneath the Burnside Bridge, he showed Archie the $5 bill and told the old soldier the whole impossible story. Archie listened in silence. When Walter finished, the old man was quiet for a long minute. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small canvas roll. He had $3.40 to his name, the savings of 2 years of begging. "Buy 2 tickets, lad," he said. "I am not letting you walk into a haunted house alone." The Spokane, Portland, and Seattle steam train pulled out of Union Station at 6 in the morning into a gray dawn the color of pewter. Walter sat by the window. Archie sat beside him, his wooden leg propped on the bench across from them. The train wound north along the Columbia River, then west toward the coast, the great green hills rolling past the firs, black with rain, the river silver and slow. Walter had never been on a train. He had never been beyond the city limits of Portland in his life. He pressed his forehead to the cold glass and watched the world he had never seen unspool before him, like a long gray dream. Astoria was a small port town of about 14,000 souls, built on the steep wooded hills above the mouth of the Columbia River. It was famous for its salmon canneries and its Victorian houses, mansions built in the 1880s when the canning fortunes were new. Fog hung in the streets like wet smoke. The air smelled of salt and tar and wood smoke. Seagulls cried overhead. Walter and Archie stepped off the train at the Astoria depot at 12:14 in the afternoon. They walked. Walter carried his burlap sack. Archie pulled his cart behind him with a thin leather strap, $2 in their pockets between them. The fog parted before them and closed behind them. At the foot of the hill, they came to a wooden street sign hammered into the ground. Briarwood Lane. They walked up, and then they stopped. Walter set down his sack. Archie set down his cart. Neither of them spoke. What stood at the top of the hill behind a wrought iron gate red with rust was not a house. It was a cathedral of decay, a 3-story Victorian mansion. Once it had been beautiful. Now it was rotting into the earth, the gray paint peeled from the clapboards in long, diseased strips. Half the windows were shattered, jagged edges like broken teeth. Thorned ivy crawled up the walls in a green strangling tide. The roof had lost dozens of shingles, leaving the raw wood exposed to 40 years of coastal storms. The front porch sagged in the middle, held up only by the ivy. The wraparound porch railings tilted at angles that suggested gravity had given up on them. This was Walter's inheritance. This was his sanctuary. This was the lifeline he had been thrown. It was a noose. He sank down onto the gatepost. He put his face in his hands. The fog rolled around him. His shoulders began to shake. Archie said nothing for a long time. Then he laid one calloused hand on the boy's back. "Lad," the old soldier said quietly, "I have seen worse than this in the trenches at Verdun. This is only wood and nails. You have not lost yet." Walter wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He stood up. He picked up his sack. He drew the heavy brass key from his pocket. The same brass key 60 years later would rest on a side table beside a fireplace, while a 12-year-old boy named Jonah listened with his mouth open. Walter pushed the key into the front door. The lock was rusted. He had to put his shoulder to the wood to force it open. The door groaned like a wounded animal. The smell that came out of the dark was the smell of 40 years of mildew and wet wood and dust and forgotten grief. He stepped inside. Behind him, Archie followed the iron wheels of his little cart, squeaking on the warped floorboards. The first night, they built a small fire in the great stone hearth of the parlor, with broken pieces of an old wooden chair. They had no electricity. The house had been wired for it, but the lines were long dead. Old Cornelius Whitaker had used kerosene lamps to the end of his life. They had no running water. They drank from a metal canteen Archie had carried since France. They slept on the dusty floor wrapped in two moth-eaten blankets they found in a pantry. The wind came in through the broken windows and moaned through the empty rooms. Somewhere upstairs, something dragged itself slowly across the floorboards. Mice, Walter told himself. Only mice. Archie whispered in the dark, his Glasgow voice hoarse with cold. This house has secrets, lad. I can feel them. The way I felt the German tunnels at Sam Mihiel before they blew. Walter did not sleep. He stared at the dying fire and thought of his mother. He thought of the man called Bennett Whitaker, the father he had barely known, who had died at 23 in the cold black water off Ireland. He thought of the man called Cornelius Whitaker, the grandfather who had stood across a green and watched him help an old woman with her bread. And he thought of the small, dark smile of Charles Thornwood in the doorway of his brother's office. He did not yet know that the smile was a knife. When dawn came gray and cold, Walter sat up. Something had shifted in him during the night. The boy who had been thrown out by his own mother had died at the gatepost. A different man, harder and quieter and infinitely more determined, had taken his place. He was a Whitaker, whatever that meant, and he had 60 days to save what was his. He explored the house room by room that first morning. The hallways were strangely narrow, the ceilings of certain rooms unnaturally low, as though Cornelius had been remodeling for decades to a plan no architect would have understood. The wallpaper hung in long, peeling sheets like dead skin. The kitchen linoleum was cracked. The cast-iron sink was stained orange with rust. On the second floor at the back of the house, he found a small study. The walls were lined with books, most of them ruined by damp, but the desk in the middle of the room was untouched. A heavy oak desk with brass fittings, yellowed papers stacked in trays, a black and white portrait in a silver frame on the corner. Walter picked up the portrait. It was a photograph of an old man with white hair and the sharp, tired eyes of a sailor. Beside him in a smaller frame was a younger man in a navy uniform, the high white collar, the round white cap. The same man from the tintype in his mother's cedar trunk. His father, Bennett. He had not seen that face since he was 9 years old. Walter sank into the desk chair. He stared at the two faces. 3 generations of Whitaker men, each of them strangers to the others, separated by water and war, and a mother's secret. Father, he said softly to the empty room. There on the corner of the desk beside the portrait lay a small folded note. The paper was yellowed, the ink, the brown of old fountain pen ink. Walter unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, the strokes of a man whose mind had been coming apart at the edges. It read, "The first $100 belongs to the finder. The rest belongs to the worthy. The child must find it himself. If he is of my blood, he will understand." Walter stared at the note for a long time. He read it again. He read it a third time. He whispered to the empty room, "Find what?" Outside the cracked window of the study, the Pacific fog rolled in from the sea, and somewhere beneath the rotting floorboards, in a place no human eye had seen for 40 years, the bones of a forgotten fortune began to wake. Walter slept that second night with the folded note tucked inside his shirt against his heart, the way a soldier sleeps with a letter from home. The wind off the Pacific worked at the broken windows like a thief's fingers. Somewhere in the walls, water dripped onto wood. Archie snored softly across the dead hearth, his wooden cart parked beside him like a faithful dog. In the morning, Walter woke up hungry. The hunger was not the polite hunger of a missed meal. It was the bone-deep ache of a working man's body that had been fed only on broth and stale bread for 3 weeks. His stomach cramped. His vision swam when he stood up too fast. He chewed on the last heel of pumpernickel from St. Stephen's, sharing half with Archie, and he knew that if they did not eat real food today, they would not be exploring much of anything tomorrow. The cold was the second enemy. The coastal damp had soaked into the walls of the house like ink into a blotter. Even in the parlor where they had built the fire, the air bit at his ears. They needed to keep the fire burning, and to keep the fire burning, they needed wood. There was no firewood in the shed. The shed had collapsed years ago, the timbers rotted black. There was no axe. There was a rusted iron fire poker beside the great stone hearth, and there was the sturdy oak of the bookshelves in the library at the back of the house. The books themselves were ruined, pulpy black bricks of mildew. But the shelves, when Walter rapped them with his knuckles, gave back the dry, hard sound of seasoned wood. Archie watched him with one gray eyebrow raised. "Are you about to commit literary murder, lad?" "I'm about to commit survival," Walter said. He picked up the iron poker. He carried it into the library. He chose the largest of the built-in shelves, the one that ran from floor to ceiling along the north wall. He wedged the poker behind the lower corner. He braced his thin shoulder against it. He pushed. The wood gave a soft groan. He pushed harder. A loud splintering crack shook the room. The whole bottom panel of the bookcase ripped away from the wall, taking a 4-foot section of the baseboard with it. A great gray cloud of plaster dust mushroomed up from the floor. Walter coughed. He waved a hand in front of his face. He squinted into the haze. When the dust began to settle, he saw something that did not belong in a wall. The hollow space behind the broken baseboard was not lined with horsehair plaster the way the rest of the wall was. It was lined with thin sheets of dull gray metal. Tin. Walter ran his fingertips across it. The tin was cold. It had been hand-soldered at the seams. Whoever had built this hidden compartment had built it the way a sailor builds a watertight hold, to keep the moisture out. And inside the compartment, sitting on the dusty floor of the secret cavity, was a heavy iron strongbox, painted dark green, the size of a small suitcase, sealed with a brass padlock the size of a man's fist. Walter knelt down slowly. He did not breathe. Behind him, Archie's wooden cart creaked closer. The old soldier let out a low whistle through his teeth. "Mother of God, lad," Archie whispered, "and this is just the beginning." Walter dragged the strong box out into the gray light of the library. It was heavier than it had any right to be, 20 pounds, maybe more. He lifted the iron poker. He brought it down on the brass padlock. Once, twice. On the fifth strike, the rusted internal pin shattered with a small, sharp sound. The padlock fell away. Walter raised the lid. He saw the pale green of old American currency. He sat back on his heels. He could not believe what he was seeing. Bound in brittle rubber bands neatly stacked were $10 and $20 notes. Old bills, the kind printed between 1914 and 1922, Buffalo nickels and Liberty coins were tucked among them in small velvet pouches. Walter counted with shaking fingers. $100. Then he found something else among the bills. A single $20 gold coin a Libertyhound had struck at the Denver Mint in 1907, the very year of his birth. Walter had never seen a gold coin in his life. He held it up. It caught the light from the window and threw a small yellow circle on the wall. Beneath the coin and the cash sat a heavy black book, bound in cracked leather, bound shut with a strip of rawhide. Walter set the cash aside. He drew the book out of the strongbox. He cut the rawhide with his pocket knife. The pages were filled with the jagged, rushing handwriting of a man whose mind was no longer at peace. The ink was brown. The dates began in 1917 and ended in the spring of 1925. It was the journal of Cornelius Whitaker. Walter sat down on the dusty library floor and read by the watery November light coming through the broken window. Archie lit a kerosene lamp and held it patiently for him. The boy read aloud, his voice halting at first, then steadying as the dead man's words began to take shape. October the 14th, 1923. They think I lost it all. They think the railroad panic of 1907 swallowed every dollar. The fools. A bank is a house you do not own. I own this house. I own these walls. The foundation is a lie. The blueprint is the map. Walter looked up at Archie. The old soldier's gray eyes were fixed on the page. Read on, lad. Walter turned the page. April the 2nd, 1924. Bennett, my boy, my only boy, I am sorry I did not save you from that war. The German submarine that took your ship took my heart down with it. But I have found your son Bennett. I have seen the boy. He stopped in the middle of Pioneer Square in the August heat and helped an old woman pick up her bread. He tipped his cap to her. He refused her penny. He had your father's smile, Bennett. He had your mother's hands. I will not fail him as I failed you. I will leave him everything. I will leave him the only thing in this rotten century worth leaving. Walter's eyes began to burn. He did not let himself cry. He turned the page. There were architectural drawings, crude but precise. The cross-section of a house, the cross-section of a wall, a floor plan of the parlor with arrows pointing inside the chimney brick, a floor plan of the second floor with arrows pointing into the joists, a floor plan of the basement with a single bold arrow pointing down towards something labeled in trembling capitals, where the coal once slept. The last entry, written in May of 1925, 3 months before the old man died, contained a single line that Walter read 3 times before he understood it. There are 3 locks. The first is the bait. The second is the test. The third is the truth. The child must find it himself. If he is of my blood, he will understand. And when the door opens, let him remember this. There is no gold in this world worth more than a roof over the head of a man with nowhere to go. Walter closed the journal. He looked up at the high cobweb ceiling of the library. For the first time in his life, he felt the unmistakable presence of a man he had never met. A grandfather reaching across the years from beyond the grave with 2 hands. One hand offering a fortune, the other hand offering a lesson. That night, the rain came hard off the Pacific. Walter and Archie sat at a small table in the kitchen, the kerosene lamp between them, the journal open between them. They were eating cold beans from a can and a half loaf of fresh bread that Walter had walked into the village to buy with 3 of the rescued $10 bills. The first hot food in 3 days. They ate slowly, the way men eat when they finally believe there will be a tomorrow. Outside, beyond the boarded windows, a sound rose above the rain. The crunch of iron-rimmed wheels on the gravel of the long driveway. Walter froze. Archie froze. Their eyes met across the lamp. Walter stood up slowly. He walked to the kitchen window. He moved the curtain a half-inch. He looked out into the storm. A 2-wheeled buggy had pulled up at the gate. A single black horse stood in the harness, steam rising from its wet flanks. A figure stepped down from the buggy, tall, dressed in a long oilcloth coat black with rain, a leather electric flashlight in one hand. Walter recognized the new technology, the kind of pocket lamp that ran on dry cell batteries, the kind only the wealthy could afford. The figure walked up the driveway, up the rotting porch steps, up to the heavy front door. A key slid into the lock. Walter heard the small metal scraping clearly. The intruder had a key, but Edmund Thornwood had ordered the locks changed 2 weeks before when the estate first went into probate. The deadbolt did not turn. The door did not open. A muffled voice cursed from the porch. The words came clearly through the broken transom above the door. "Damn it, Edmund." Walter's blood went cold. The intruder knew the lawyer by his first name. The intruder knew the locks had been changed. The intruder knew this house and this estate and the missing fortune within these walls. Walter blew out the kerosene lamp. He grabbed the iron poker. He pressed himself flat against the kitchen wall. Archie, with a soldier's instinct, pulled himself silently into the deep coat closet by the back stairs and drew the door shut behind him. The old man could not fight, not on one leg. Both of them understood this without speaking. The sound of breaking glass. The intruder had given up on the lock. He had smashed the narrow window beside the front door, reached his hand through and twisted the deadbolt from the inside. The heavy front door groaned open. Cold rain swept into the foyer. A flashlight beam cut through the dark hallway. Walter held his breath. Footsteps, wet leather boots on warped pine floorboards. The intruder moved slowly. He was not a thief in a panic. He was a hunter taking his time. Walter heard him stop in the foyer, heard him strike a match, heard the soft hiss of a kerosene lamp being lit. The orange glow began to spread along the hall. The man started talking to himself. It was the slow, confident muttering of a gambler convinced his next hand will be the winning one. "Lock's changed. Of course it's changed, the old fool. But the boy isn't here yet. I checked every flophouse in Astoria. Nobody's seen him. I have 3 days, maybe 4, before he claims the deed. Plenty of time." Walter's eyes narrowed. He recognized the voice now, the cadence of a man who had been in his lawyer's office 2 weeks ago. "Charles Thornwood," the intruder went on. $60,000. The old lunatic withdrew $60,000 from Wells Fargo before the war ended and never deposited it anywhere else. It has to be in the walls, has to be. Walter's lips moved silently in the dark. $60,000. In 1925, $60,000 was the price of a city block in downtown Manhattan. It was a fortune that could buy 10 of these houses. It was a number so large it did not feel like a real number. The flashlight beam crept down the hallway and into the library. Charles stopped at the broken bookcase. He stared at the splintered hole Walter had made the day before. He laughed softly. "Well now," he murmured, "look at that." He set down the kerosene lamp on a side table. He reached into his coat. He drew out a small, flat pry bar. He bent down and began to inspect the secret compartment. Walter in the kitchen felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He closed his eyes. He breathed through his nose. He prayed in the small, wordless way that boys pray that Charles Thornwood would do the wrong thing. And Charles Thornwood, full of greed and cheap whiskey and the terrible certainty of his own cleverness, did exactly that. He stepped backward to better measure the chimney brickwork that rose beside the bookcase. He took 2 steps back without looking down at his feet. He stepped onto a faded Persian rug at the center of the library floor. Walter knew that rug. Walter had walked carefully around that rug for 2 days. The floorboards beneath that rug had been eaten hollow by 40 years of dry rot, fed by a slow leak in the roof 3 stories above. There was a sharp, dry crack, the sound of seasoned oak surrendering all at once. Charles Thornwood's right leg punched straight through the floor up to his thigh. He let out a high, strangled cry of pain. The kerosene lamp on the side table tipped, fell, struck the stone hearth, and shattered. Burning oil spread across 2 flagstones in a small blue circle. Walter moved. He did not run upstairs. He did not run for the front door. He moved like a man who knew his enemy's blindness. He crossed the dark kitchen, slipped into the small storage cupboard beneath the main staircase, opened the closet from the inside, helped Archie out into the corridor, and the two of them retreated together to the back pantry. Walter shut the heavy oak door of the pantry and pressed the iron pin of an old butler's bolt home. The bolt was forged. It was solid. For 30 long minutes, they listened. They heard Charles Thornwood thrash and curse in the splintered floor. They heard him stamp out the burning oil with his good boot. They heard him drag his right leg free, the wet ripping sound of flesh torn open by jagged oak. They heard him limp through every room, his electric flashlight beam sliding along the cracks beneath every door. He came to the pantry door. He tried the handle. The bolt held. He cursed again louder. His footsteps moved away. The front door slammed. The buggy rattled away into the storm. Archie exhaled. He whispered through the dark, "Lad, your father, your grandfather, those men are watching from the other side. This house knows. It is protecting you." Walter did not answer for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "He's coming back, and next time he will bring a gun." The next morning before the fog had lifted, Walter walked the 3 miles into the village of Astoria. He carried 4 $10 bills in the lining of his cap. He walked fast. The wind was off the river. The streets smelled of salmon and tar and sawdust. He walked into Pike & Sons, the largest hardware store in town. The wooden sign above the door had been repainted 3 times in 50 years. The bell tinkled as he stepped inside. The man behind the counter was perhaps 70 years old. White beard, wire spectacles, apron stained with linseed oil. He looked up as Walter approached. He took one long look at the boy's face. He went pale. "Lord have mercy," the old man whispered. "Lord have mercy, you are the spit and image of Bennett Whitaker. You are Bennett's boy, aren't you, son?" Walter froze, his mouth went dry. He nodded slowly. The shopkeeper's name was Abner Pike. He had known Cornelius Whitaker for 43 years. He came around the counter and grasped Walter's hand in both of his. He led the boy to the back of the shop behind a stack of seed bags and made him sit on a wooden crate. He poured Walter a cup of black coffee from a battered enamel pot. "Cornelius Whitaker was the finest man I ever knew," Abner said quietly. "Before 1907, before the railroad panic took half of his fortune, even after that, he was a good man. He stood up at this very counter once and paid for a widow's coal stove in cash because she could not afford the winter. That kind of man." Abner's eyes grew wet. But after Bennett died on the Jacob Jones, the heart went out of him. He stopped coming into town. He stopped going to church. He boarded up the windows of the big house. The children of this village began to call it the haunted house. They threw rocks at the windows. They told ghost stories about the old captain. He never came out to chase them off. I think he believed he deserved it. Walter listened. He felt the slow sting of tears at the corners of his eyes. He pushed them down. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice careful, "has anyone come to town recently asking about that house?" Abner Pike's white eyebrows pulled together. He nodded slowly. "A young fella in a pinstripe suit, slick black hair, drove a hired buggy up from Portland, came in twice, asked if the old Whitaker place was occupied, asked who held the deed, did not give his name, did not buy nothing, did not look me in the eye." Abner spat into a brass cuspidor on the floor. "I did not like the smell of him." Walter's jaw tightened. So it was true. Charles Thornwood had been hunting the house for weeks. He had not stumbled into this. He had planned it. He had measured the boy from across his brother's office and decided that an 18-year-old orphan was not a threat. He had been wrong. He did not know it yet. But he had been wrong. Walter laid two $10 bills on the counter. He bought a Yale brass deadbolt of the heaviest grade. He bought a new long-handled crowbar of forged steel. He bought two oil lanterns and a quart of clean kerosene. He bought a tin of waterproof matches. He bought a loaf of fresh bread, a pound of smoked bacon, 3 cans of beans, and a wedge of cheddar cheese. And in the back of the shop, locked in a glass cabinet, he saw the dull blue barrel of an old Winchester Model 1905 repeating rifle. $8. Walter paid $8 in cash. Abner Pike wrapped the rifle in oilcloth and set it on the counter without a word. He met Walter's eye. "Son," he said, "if there is trouble at the house, you walk to the Lighthouse Cafe down on Commercial Street. You ask for Sheriff Marshall Holloway. You tell him you are Bennett Whitaker's boy. You will not regret it." Walter shook the old man's hand. He carried his supplies down the steep wooden sidewalks toward the harbor, and he found the Lighthouse Cafe. It was a narrow little place that smelled of coffee and griddled bacon. He sat at the counter. He ordered a plate of eggs and a cup of black coffee with the change in his pocket. The man on the next stool was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 55, a six-pointed sheriff's star pinned to his coat, a kind, weathered face. Walter studied him for a long moment, then finally cleared his throat. "Sheriff Holloway," the big man turned. "That I am, son. My name is Walter Ashby. My father was Bennett Whitaker." Marshall Holloway set down his coffee cup. The cup made a small, careful sound on the saucer. He looked at Walter for a long time. Then his face did a thing that Walter had not seen on a grown man's face since he was very small. It softened. It opened. The eyes filled. "Son," the sheriff said quietly, "your grandfather pulled me out of the ocean in 1898 off Cape Disappointment when the lumber schooner Andrew Foster broke up on the bar. I was 28 years old, a green deputy. I would have drowned. He swam out into water cold enough to stop a man's heart, and he hauled me back. He never accepted a thank you. He said, 'Only you find a man drowning, you swim.' That's all." Marshall Holloway slid Walter's check off the counter and placed his own quarter on it. He paid for the eggs. He paid for the coffee. He pressed a small square of paper into Walter's hand. "That number on the paper, son, is the direct line to my office. Astoria 247. Most folks in this town don't have a telephone yet. The cafe here has one. The general store has one. You walk into either place and you ring me and I will come." Walter put the slip of paper inside his shirt next to Cornelius Whitaker's note. 2 pieces of paper now pressed against his heart. He walked back up Briarwood Lane through the thinning afternoon fog. Archie was waiting for him on the front porch with the iron poker across his knees. They installed the new Yale deadbolt. They nailed cedar planks across the broken kitchen window. They moved the table in the parlor so it covered the door. They loaded the Winchester. Archie cleaned the barrel with a soft rag the way a soldier cleans a rifle slowly and respectfully. That night, by the light of the new oil lamps, Walter sat at the kitchen table and read the journal of Cornelius Whitaker again, page by page, sentence by sentence, the way a scholar reads a sacred text. This time he was looking for the second lock. He found it on a page he had skipped 2 days before, a page of architectural drawings, a cross-section of the house drawn from the side, showing all 3 stories and the basement beneath. A red arrow had been inked with great care, pointing down from the parlor floor, through the joists and into the basement. Beside the arrow, a line of jagged words. "The roots hold the tree. Water runs down. Heat rises up. The false floor breathes where the coal once slept." Walter ran his thumb along the line. He read it again. "The false floor, where the coal once slept. He had not yet been into the basement. He had not yet found the door. Walter stood up. He took the oil lamp in his right hand and the new crowbar in his left. Archie stayed in the parlor with the loaded Winchester across his knees, watching the front of the house. They had agreed. The old soldier would guard the front. The boy would go down. The basement door was not where any reasonable house would put it. Walter walked the lower hallway 3 times before the journal made him understand. There was a panel of wainscoting halfway down the corridor that did not match the rest of the wood. Slightly newer, slightly different grain. Walter pressed it. He pushed at every corner. Then he slid his fingers along the chair rail above it. A small brass button was set flush into the molding. He pressed it. The panel sprang outward an inch with a small mechanical click. Walter pulled it open. Behind it, a narrow stairway descended into absolute black. The air that breathed up from below was different than the air in the rest of the house. It was colder. It smelled of damp earth and rusted iron and something deeper than dust. The smell of long sleep. Walter held the lamp out and started down. The basement of the Whitaker house was vast. It matched the full footprint of the mansion above. The ceiling was low, 8 feet at most, and crossed by heavy beams of black walnut darkened by time. The floor was hard-packed dirt in some places and broken brick in others. The lamplight reached only as far as the next shelf, the next pile of forgotten furniture. Beyond the lamp, the dark went on and on. Walter saw the shapes of broken grandfather clocks, stacks of yellowed newspapers from the 1880s tied with hairy twine, a child's cradle covered in a sheet, crates of empty wine bottles from the days before Prohibition, a whaling harpoon mounted on a wooden plank, its iron point still wickedly sharp. He walked through the maze. The lamplight flickered. He kept his eyes on the journal's drawing in his mind. In the far corner of the cellar, he found it. A great brick-lined alcove. The bricks were black with old soot. Built into the back wall of the alcove, blackened by the heat of half a century of burning anthracite, was a coal chute door. The iron door had been welded shut years ago. Cobwebs hung from the hinges in long gray drapes. The smell of old coal dust hung in the air, faint but unmistakable. This was where the coal had once slept. Walter set the lamp on a brick shelf. He turned to the journal in his other hand. He found the page with the numerical sequence. Cornelius had written beside the bricks one long string of numerals. 4, 1, 2, 9, 2, 7. Walter looked up at the wall. The bricks of the alcove were laid in long, flat courses, each course about 3 inches high. Walter began to count. 4 bricks up from the floor, 1 brick to the right. He pressed his thumb against the rough clay face of that brick. He pushed. Nothing. The brick was dead solid, like every other brick. Walter waited. He pressed harder. He pressed with both thumbs. He tried the brick beside it. He tried the brick above it. He tried every brick in a 1-foot square. None of them moved. The wall was simply a wall. He stepped back. He looked up at the lamp. The despair began to creep in at the edges. Maybe Cornelius Whitaker had been mad after all. Maybe the journal was the broken architecture of a sick mind, and there was no fortune, no second lock, no truth. Maybe there was only this rotting house and a tax bill he could not pay, and a wealthy young lawyer who would shoot him through the ribs. He sat down on the dirt floor. He put his face in his hands, and then his eye caught the journal again. He opened it. He read the numerical sequence one more time. 4, 1, 2, 9, 2, 7. He stared at the last 3 numbers. 9, 2, 7, 9, 27, September the 27th. He went rigid. He fumbled the brown leather folder from inside his coat. The folder Edmund Thornwood had given him. He flipped through the pages until he found it. The vital statistics record. The birth certificate of the late Bennett Charles Whitaker. Born September the 27th, 1894, Walter's father. His grandfather had remembered in a fractured and shattered mind the birthday of the son he had lost to a German submarine. 8 years dead, and Cornelius Whitaker had still remembered the day his only boy had come into the world. It was the last love that had survived in him. Walter rose to his feet. His hand was shaking. He set the journal down. He turned back to the wall. He counted again slowly. 9 bricks across the middle row. 7 bricks down from the top of the chute door. He pressed his thumbs against that brick. There was a sharp, crisp click, a mechanical sound. The brick depressed an inch into the wall. For one long breath, nothing happened. Then the floor began to hum. A deep, grinding rumble vibrated up through the soles of Walter's boots. The whole rear wall of the brick alcove, a slab of masonry 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall and weighing several hundred pounds, began to swing slowly inward. Not on rotting hinges, on heavy steel pivots concealed inside the wall, counterweighted with iron and lead, the kind of door a man builds when he has spent his youth on warships and has learned how to hide a thing where no one will ever find it. Walter raised the lamp. The light spilled into a small, reinforced concrete room beyond the brick wall. The chamber was perhaps 8 feet square. The ceiling was barely tall enough for him to stand. The walls were poured concrete gray and damp. The air inside was 40 years old, cold as a tomb. But the room was not empty. Standing on heavy iron shelves, 3 shelves deep, 4 shelves high, was rank after rank of dull yellow bricks. Stamped on the face of every brick in deep, neat letters were the words U.S. Mint, Denver, 1922. Each bar weighed precisely 400 troy ounces. Walter did not yet know that. He only knew at that moment that he was looking at metal he had read about in newspapers. The metal kings had killed for the metal bankers had cheated for. The metal that did not rust and did not lie. Gold! Walter sank to his knees on the dirt floor of the basement. The lamp shook in his hand. The light wavered across the rows of dull yellow bars. Cornelius Whitaker had not been mad. Cornelius Whitaker had been a prophet. He had pulled his entire fortune out of the banks before they could fail again. He had converted every dollar into bullion at the Denver Mint and had hauled it home over the rails in cedar crates marked agricultural equipment. He had built this vault under his own house with his own hands in the years when grief had given him nothing else to do. He had been preparing for a great crash that was still 4 years away. He had not lived to see it. Walter put a hand against the cold concrete wall to steady himself. He whispered to the empty room, to the man whose bones lay in the Astoria cemetery on the hill above the river, to the grandfather he had never met. I see it now. I understand. The first tear of his life that was not a tear of grief or fear ran slowly down his cheek. It was a tear of inheritance, a tear of belonging, a tear of being for the first time at 18 years of age somebody's grandson. He stepped into the vault. He laid one cold hand on the top bar. The metal was solid. The metal was real. For the first time in 3 weeks, he allowed himself a thought he had not dared think. He would never sleep beneath a wet bridge again. He could pay the $487 in back taxes 1,000 times over. He could buy Archibald McCready a real house with a real bed. He could find his mother and pull her out of that flat above the butcher shop. He could do good things in this world. He remembered the line his grandfather had written in the last entry of the journal. The line about the roof and the man with nowhere to go. The line that mattered, he understood now more than the gold itself. Walter lifted the lamp higher, and from behind him, from the doorway of the brick alcove, came a voice. Impressive, kid. The voice was sharp. The voice was gleaming with malice. Walter spun around. The oil lamp tipped from his shaking hand. It struck the dirt floor and the wick guttered, and the spilled oil caught, and a small ring of blue flame whispered around his boots. Standing in the entrance of the alcove, blocking the only exit, was Charles Thornwood. His right leg was wrapped in a hasty splint of pine board and torn shirt. He leaned heavily on a walnut cane. His pin-striped suit was filthy with mud and dried blood. His mouth was a thin, cruel line. In his right hand, leveled steadily at the center of Walter's chest, was a black Colt 1911 automatic pistol. The hammer was cocked. The safety was off. And on the dirt floor of the cellar, behind Charles, motionless, beside an overturned crate, lay Archibald Macready. The old soldier's gray hair was dark with blood. His harmonica had fallen from his hand and lay in the dirt 3 feet from his fingers. He was not moving. Walter could not tell in that one frozen second of lamplight and shadow whether his friend was alive or dead. Charles Thornwood smiled. Well, kid, he said softly, you found it faster than I did. I suppose mad old Cornelius picked the right boy after all. Now step out of the vault slowly and bring me one of those bars on your way. Walter did not move. Behind his back, his fingers brushed the cold steel of the new crowbar he had bought that morning at Pike & Sons. He had set it down on the iron shelf when he had first walked into the vault. His hand closed around it now, very quietly in the dark beyond the lamplight. The fire on the dirt floor crackled. The gold gleamed dully behind him. Charles Thornwood took one limping step forward into the alcove, and the third lock, the one that Cornelius Whitaker had warned of in his journal, the lock that was not the bait and not the test, but the truth, began very slowly to come into view. Walter's mind moved faster in those next 10 seconds than it had moved in the 18 years before them. He saw the gun. He saw Archie on the floor. He saw the small ring of blue flame around his own boots from the spilled lamp. He saw Charles Thornwood limping forward, the cane in his left hand, the Colt steady in his right. And he saw in the doorway of the brick alcove the small, dull glint of the locking lever. The lever was mounted on the outside of the vault wall, a vertical iron bar painted black, perhaps 18 inches long, hinged at the top. It controlled the counterweight system that held the great brick door in its open position. Walter had seen it without seeing it when he had first walked through the doorway. He had stepped past it without thinking. Now his eyes returned to it, and the journal of Cornelius Whitaker spoke quietly inside his head. The vault protects itself. The door answers only to the master's weight. Walter did not yet understand the second sentence. The first sentence was enough. He let his shoulders sink. He made his face afraid. The fear was not difficult. Most of it was already there. He let his lower lip tremble. He let his hands rise slowly from his sides, palms open the way a beaten boy raises his hands to a drunk stepfather. Mr. Thornwood, he said, his voice was small and broken. Please, I'm only 18. Take it. Take all of it. I just want to leave. Charles Thornwood smiled. The smile was the smile of a man who has misread the room. That is the wisest thing you have said tonight, kid, he murmured. The Colt did not move from Walter's chest, but the muzzle dropped 1/4 of an inch. The shoulders relaxed 1/2 of an inch. The mind of a gambler is a vain thing. He had already counted his winnings. He limped one step closer. Pick up a bar, kid, Charles said. One of the small ones. Bring it out here slowly, and keep your hands where I can see them. Walter turned his back on the gunman. The way a beaten dog turns its back, the way a frightened child turns its back. He took 2 steps deeper into the vault. He reached up to the iron shelf. With his right hand, he closed his fingers around a small 400-ounce bar of Denver minted gold. With his left hand behind his body hidden by his own thin shoulder, he closed his fingers around the cold steel of the new forged crowbar from Pike & Sons. He turned around very slowly. The vault doorway was about 5 feet wide. Charles Thornwood stood in the center of it, his bad leg planted his good leg ready to step. The locking lever for the brick door was 18 inches behind Charles on the outer face of the brick alcove, hidden from Charles's line of sight by the angle of the brickwork. Walter walked toward him with the gold bar held out in trembling offering. 3 steps, 2 steps, 1 step. Charles licked his lips. The colt drifted lower. The eyes drifted to the dull yellow bar. The eyes drifted to the rows of bars stacked behind the boy. The eyes drifted for one single half-second away from Walter Ashby's face. Walter let go of the gold bar. 400 ounces of solid metal fell straight down onto Charles Thornwood's bad foot. The foot wrapped in the splint. The foot torn and bandaged and screaming with infection. The foot already beyond what his owner could bear. Charles Thornwood howled. The howl was the high-cracked howl of a man whose pain has finally exceeded the discipline of his pride. His head jerked down. His eyes left Walter for one whole second. Walter dove past him. He hit the ground rolling. His shoulder slammed into the brick of the alcove wall. The crowbar came up in his right hand. He did not aim for the gun. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for the iron lever on the wall beside the door. He swung with everything that 18 years of beatings and breadlines and lumber mill 12-hour shifts had built into his right arm. He swung with his father's death in his shoulder. He swung with his grandfather's grief in his elbow. He swung with the memory of a 16-year-old boy helping an old woman with her bread in Pioneer Square while a stranger wept across the green. The crowbar struck the iron lever flush. The lever broke free of its catch. For one suspended second, the world was perfectly silent. Charles Thornwood, still bent over his ruined foot, looked up. His mouth opened. The colt began to rise. Then the counterweights inside the wall began to move. 200 pounds of lead and iron hidden behind the masonry began their long downward fall. The great brick door, 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, swung in toward the vault on its concealed steel pivots. It moved with the slow inevitability of a freight train. The first foot was a creak. The second foot was a hiss of air being pushed out of the chamber. The third foot was the momentum of half a ton of brick obeying the patient law of gravity. Charles Thornwood saw it coming. His face changed. The smug confidence drained out of him in a single rush. The eyes ringed by sleeplessness and gambling debt, and 10 years of small bad choices went round with terror. He raised the Colt. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang inside the brick alcove like a hammer on a bell. The bullet sparked off the swinging brick door an inch from his own face and ricocheted into the dirt. He pulled the trigger again. A second shot. The second bullet struck the heavy door full on and stuck there in the brick face. The door kept moving. Charles tried to throw himself backward out of the alcove. His ruined leg buckled. He fell sideways. His shoulder caught the edge of the swinging slab. He tried to claw his way out. The door drove him back like a closing fist. He screamed Walter's name once. The scream cut off cleanly. The brick door met its frame with a deep, final, bone-deep boom that shook the dirt floor of the cellar and brought a small rain of plaster down from the ceiling beams. The iron locking bolts inside the wall slammed home one after another. 3 of them. 3 iron bolts the size of a man's wrist. The chamber on the other side became in that instant a sealed concrete tomb, reinforced with steel plates stripped from a Navy gunboat in the year 1909. Cornelius Whitaker had built the vault for one purpose: to make sure that nothing inside could ever be taken out. He had not anticipated what was inside it tonight. For a long moment, Walter did not move. He sat on the cold dirt floor of the cellar. His ears were ringing from the gunshots. The small ring of blue lamp oil flame had burned itself out in a puddle near his right boot. Behind the brick door, very faintly, came the muffled thump of fists against concrete. Then a muffled shout. Then another. Then the small, distant pop of a third pistol shot that did not even penetrate the door. Cornelius had soundproofed the chamber the way the Navy soundproofs a powder magazine. Walter laid his forehead against the cold brick of the alcove wall. He stayed there for a count of 10. He breathed. The shaking did not stop. He did not expect it to. Then he remembered Archie. He scrambled to his feet. He stumbled out of the alcove. He fell to his knees beside the old soldier sprawled in the dirt. Archibald Macready lay on his back. His Glasgow gray eyes were closed. A long, shallow cut ran from his temple down into his beard. The blood was beginning to dry. The harmonica lay 3 feet from his right hand. Walter pressed his ear to the old man's chest. He waited. There, beneath the wet wool of the army surplus coat, a heartbeat, slow, steady, stubborn as the man it belonged to. Walter let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sough. He tore off his own shirt and pressed it against the cut. He whispered, "Old man, you are not finished yet. Not by a long shot." He half carried, half dragged Archie up the basement stairs. The old soldier was lighter than Walter had expected. The years of hunger had taken weight from him. Walter laid him on the parlor sofa under the moth-eaten sheet. He covered him in the 2 blankets. He stoked the fire in the hearth until the room was warm. Then he ran. He ran the 3 miles into the village of Astoria in the cold black rain. He ran with his torn shirt under his open coat and his bare chest exposed to the storm. He ran past the boarded windows of houses where families slept in safe beds. He ran down the steep wooden sidewalks of Commercial Street. He banged on the door of the Lighthouse Cafe. The night cook opened it. Walter said one sentence: "Get me Sheriff Holloway. Bennett Whitaker's boy is calling." The night cook understood. He turned the brass crank of the wall telephone. He shouted into the receiver. Inside of 4 minutes, Marshal Holloway was striding down the cafe steps with 3 deputies behind him and the village doctor behind them. They piled into a black Model T Ford touring car. They drove up Briarwood Lane through the storm. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to leak through the broken windows of the Whitaker house, Sheriff Holloway had unlocked the brick vault door from the outside using the master release Walter had shown him in the journal. They found Charles Thornwood crumpled against the inside of the door, his pinstripe suit black with sweat, his Colt empty, his good leg shattered by his own ricocheting 3rd bullet. He had been screaming for over an hour. His voice was gone. He could not look at the sheriff. He could not look at the boy. The deputies dragged him out. They cuffed him to the bumper of the Ford. The doctor, a quiet, bearded man named Sullivan, worked over Archie on the parlor sofa for 40 minutes. He stitched the cut. He bound the head. He listened to the heart. When he stood up, he wiped his hands on a clean cloth, and he looked at Walter, and he said only, "He will live, son. The Scots are hard to kill." Walter sat on the floor beside the sofa. He held Archibald Macready's good hand. He did not let go for a long time. When Sheriff Holloway came back into the parlor, he sat down opposite Walter on a dust-sheeted chair. He took off his hat. He held it in his big hands. "Son," he said quietly, "we found something else in that vault behind the gold." Walter looked up. The sheriff produced a small steel strongbox from inside his coat. The box had been tucked behind the rearmost shelf of bullion. Walter had not seen it in the wavering lamplight. The box was unlocked. Inside, on top of a stack of broker certificates from Wells Fargo, proving the lawful purchase of every gold bar over the years between 1908 and 1922, lay a folded letter. The paper was cream-colored thick. The ink was the brown of an old fountain pen. The handwriting was a careful old man's hand, neither as jagged as the journal, nor as cold as the law. It was something in between. It was love trying to hold itself together. Walter's name was written on the outside of the folded letter. He took it from the sheriff. The sheriff stood up quietly. He gathered his deputies. He told Walter he would be on the porch when the boy was ready. He left the room. Walter unfolded the letter. "Walter, my grandson, I never met you, and that is the greatest sin of my life. When Bennett died on the Jacob Jones, I closed the door of my heart. I did not deserve a second family. Your mother was afraid of me, and she had her reasons. The Whitakers did not treat her well. I became a bitter old man and a strange one, and I think the village children were right to throw rocks at my windows. I had earned each rock, but I always knew you existed, son. In the summer of 1923, I hired a Pinkerton man to find you. He found you in 3 weeks. I traveled by train to Portland on the 12th of August of that year. I stood at the far end of Pioneer Square. You were 16 years old. You wore a workman's cap that was too big for your head. An old woman dropped a parcel of bread in the heat of the afternoon. You stopped what you were doing, you picked it up, you handed it back, you tipped your cap. She offered you a penny, you refused it. You smiled at her grandson, and that smile was the smile your father had at 16 the year I saw him last as a boy. I stood there for 20 minutes, grandson. I did not come closer. I was afraid of what your mother would do. I was afraid of what I had become. And then I went home and I wept on the train all the way back to Astoria, and I began to write my will the next morning. The gold in the vault is everything I had left. Use it for good. Do not let it turn you into me. Open the doors of this house, son. Do not close them. Remember always there is no gold in this world worth more than a roof over the head of a man with nowhere to go. Your grandfather who loved you across 2 years of silence. Cornelius Whitaker, June 1924. Walter sat on the parlor floor with the letter in his hands. The morning light came slowly through the broken window and fell across the page. He read the letter 3 times. He read the part about the loaf of bread 3 more times. And then for the first time since his mother had refused to meet his eyes on the morning of his 18th birthday, Walter Ashby allowed himself to weep. Not a boy's weeping. The weeping of a man who has just learned late and at terrible cost that he was loved by someone for 2 long years and never knew. Old Archibald Macready opened his good eye on the sofa above him. The Scottish voice was very weak. "Lad," he whispered, "are you crying?" "Yes, Archie." "Why?" Walter pressed the letter to his chest. "Because somebody loved me, old man, and I never knew." Archie closed his eye again and smiled into the blanket. "Cry then, lad. Cry it all out. You waited 18 years for it." Edmund Thornwood arrived from Portland on the 8 o'clock steamboat the next morning. The old lawyer climbed the porch steps slowly. He looked to Walter 10 years older than he had 2 weeks before. His silver hair was uncombed. His eyes were red-rimmed. He had not slept since the deputies had brought the news to his door. He sat in the parlor with his hat on his knees. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a tree in heavy wind. I knew Charles was gambling. I knew he was losing. I knew there were men in Chicago he owed money to. I tried to bring him to me. I said, Charles, come and confess it. We will work it out. We are family. But he would not. I refused to pay his last debt. I told him a man must face his own choices. I thought I was being a good elder brother. I see now that I was being a coward. Walter stood up. He laid his hand on the old man's shoulder. Mr. Thornwood, you did not load the gun he carried into this house. He did. You are not responsible for what he became. Edmund Thornwood put one trembling hand over the boy's hand. He did not lift his head. After a long while he nodded. Thank you, son, he said. I needed to hear that from a Whitaker. The legal work moved fast. Edmund himself oversaw every step. 2 of the 400-ounce bars were sold quietly through a discreet broker in Seattle. The Clatsop County tax collector was paid $487 in cash and given a receipt and a handshake. A trust was filed. The remaining bullion was inventoried and weighed and assayed and converted after federal taxes and the costs of probate into the sum of $52,340 in lawful currency of the United States. A figure that in the autumn of 1925 made Walter Ashby, 18 years old, formerly homeless, the second richest man in Clatsop County. Charles Thornwood was tried in Oregon State Court that December. The charges were attempted murder, armed robbery, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and assault on the elderly. The jury took 22 minutes. The sentence was 25 years at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. Charles Thornwood would die in that prison in the autumn of 1937 of pneumonia at the age of 42. Edmund would pay for the burial. He would have his brother laid in the family plot. He would visit the grave once a year on Charles's birthday until his own death in 1939. He would never speak Charles's name again. In the second week of December, while the rain ran sideways down the windows of the Astoria Depot, Walter Ashby boarded the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway with a small leather suitcase and a brown wool coat that fit him for the first time in his life. He rode the train south to Portland. He walked the familiar streets of Division Street. He climbed the staircase above the butcher shop. He knocked on the door of his mother's flat. Maggie Ashby opened the door. She saw her son. She saw the new coat. She saw the man's hat. She saw the eyes that were no longer a boy's eyes. She put one hand against the door frame to keep from falling. Behind her in the back room, Roy Calloway snored on the sofa, a half-empty mason jar of corn whiskey tilted on the floor beside him. Walter did not raise his voice. Mama, may I come in? Maggie could not speak. She stepped back. She let him in. She closed the door behind him. They stood in the kitchen where she had kneaded bread for 18 years. She could not look at him. He did not sit. He did not take off his coat. Mama, I am not here to ask forgiveness. I am not here to take revenge. I am here to tell you a truth that you hid from me for 18 years. She closed her eyes. He went on very quietly. My father had a last name, Mama. It was Whitaker. He was the only son of a sea captain named Cornelius Whitaker, who lived in a Victorian house on a bluff above the Columbia River in Astoria. My grandfather hired a Pinkerton detective to find me in the summer of 1923. He stood across Pioneer Square on a hot August day and watched me help an old woman pick up her bread. He kept a photograph of me in his wallet until the day he died. He left me everything he owned, and you, Mama, hid him from me. You hid them both from me because you were afraid." Tears began to run down Maggie's face. She did not wipe them. "I understand why you were afraid. The Whitakers were proud people, and they hurt you. I will not blame you for that fear. I am not a judge. But I will tell you this, Mama. Your fear cost me the truth of my own father. Your fear cost me a grandfather who would have loved me from the day I could walk. And then, Mama, when Roy Calloway came along, your fear cost me a home." Maggie sank to her knees on the kitchen linoleum. She put her face in her hands. The sob that came out of her, there was the sob of 18 years of silence breaking at once. Walter knelt down opposite her. He did not take her in his arms. Not yet. He laid an envelope on the linoleum between them. The envelope was thick. "There is $200 in this envelope, Mama. It is enough to leave Roy. It is enough to take a small flat in the Goose Hollow neighborhood for a year. It is enough to start over. The choice is yours. I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you that for the first time in your life, you have a choice that does not depend on a man." He stood up. He put his hat back on his head. "I have bought back the house in Astoria. I am turning it into a place for boys like I was, and old soldiers like Archie, and women who have been hit by men. I will be there. If you choose to leave Roy, you may come and find me. The door will be open to you, Mama. It will always be open to you. But I cannot wait here. I cannot live next door to that man. I have my own life to build now." Maggie raised her face to him. Her eyes were the eyes of a woman who has been frightened for so long that she has forgotten what her face looks like without fear. But beneath the fear, very small and very deep, something flickered. A tiny ember, the first light of her old self returning. "Walter," she whispered, "give me time. I will give you all the time you need, Mama." He kissed her on the forehead. He left the flat. He went down the stairways past the smell of blood and sawdust. He walked into the rain with his hat pulled low and his eyes wet, and his shoulders, for the first time in his life, perfectly straight. Maggie Ashby left Roy Calloway 4 months later, in the spring of 1926. She arrived on the train at Astoria with a single suitcase and Walter's photograph clutched in her gloved hand. Walter was waiting on the platform. He took the suitcase from her. He took her arm. He walked her up the hill. She lived with him in the old Whitaker house for 23 years. She taught reading lessons in the parlor every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. She taught hundreds of homeless boys to write their own names. She never took another drink, and she never married another man. She died in the autumn of 1948 in Walter's arms in the upstairs bedroom that had once belonged to Cornelius Whitaker. The last word she spoke was a name she had not allowed herself to say in 31 years. Bennett. By the autumn of 1926, the house at 442 Briarwood Lane no longer looked like the haunted Whitaker mansion of village legend. The peeling gray paint had been scraped away and replaced with a warm Victorian blue with crisp white trim. The shattered windows had been replaced with new stained glass commissioned from a craftsman in Seattle. The sagging porch had been rebuilt in good Douglas fir, reinforced with steel brackets, and it now held a long row of cedar rocking chairs. The roof had been reshingled. The chimneys had been repointed. The thorned ivy had been cut back to the foundation and replaced with neat beds of hydrangeas. Inside, the smell of mildew had been replaced with the smell of fresh pine soap and baking bread and wood smoke, and the laughter of men and boys. The hidden compartment in the library had been sealed shut forever, and the broken bookcase had been replaced with new shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, filled with new books donated from the Astoria Public Library. The basement vault had been emptied. The gold had become a trust fund managed by Edmund Thornwood and 3 other trustees in Portland. The brick door had been wedged permanently open. The concrete chamber had been turned into a storage room for canned food and winter blankets. The brick alcove above it had been turned into a small carpentry shop, where men with calloused hands taught boys with empty hands how to build chairs and frame doors, and turn a length of pine into something useful. Above the front door of the house, a hand-carved cedar sign now hung from 2 iron chains. The letters had been carved by Walter himself with a chisel taught to him by a one-legged Scotsman. The sign read Ashby and Macready House, a home for veterans, widows, and boys of the road. Established October 1926. On the first cold evening of November of that year, Walter stood on the front porch in a flannel shirt and corduroy work pants. He watched 3 veterans of the war walk slowly down the lane toward the new gate. They were the 20th, 21st, and 22nd men to come up the hill since the house had opened. None of them had been turned away. Old Archibald Macready, his head healed and his eyes bright with stubborn life, sat in the rocking chair beside Walter on a cushion of soft leather. He had been made the manager of the house. He still used his wooden cart to get around. He taught reading and writing every morning to any man who could not read his own discharge papers, and there were many such men. Sheriff Marshal Holloway came up the lane every Sunday after church. He sat with the men on the porch and drank coffee and told stories about Cornelius Whitaker and the bar at the mouth of the Columbia. He had become in everything but name the grandfather of the house. Mr. Abner Pike of Pike and Sons donated a wagon load of lumber and nails every spring. Edmund Thornwood, at the age of 66 and still grieving, took the train up from Portland once a month to handle the legal paperwork without charge. He never accepted $1 for the work. He told Walter once on the porch in the rain that the work had become the thing that kept him alive. That night in November of 1926, with the fog rolling up from the Columbia River and the lighthouse at Tillamook Rock blinking its slow orange wink across the water, the bell at the front gate rang. Walter walked down the lane with a kerosene lantern. The bell at the gate was an old ship's bell that Cornelius had brought home from his last whaling voyage. Walter unlatched the gate. Standing in the rain soaked through to his thin bones was a boy of about 17 years old. A torn coat, a canvas knapsack pressed against his chest, the eyes of a boy who had been thrown out by someone who should have loved him. Walter knew those eyes. He had seen them in a mirror exactly 1 year before. The boy did not speak. Walter held the gate open. "Come in, son," he said gently. "There is hot soup on the stove. There is a bed upstairs with sheets your grandmother might have washed if you'd had one. The door of your room locks from the inside. No man may enter without your permission, not even me." The boy's mouth trembled. "I have nothing to pay with, sir." Walter smiled. The smile was very small. It was the smile of a man who has finally understood what his grandfather had tried to tell him. "Someone already paid, son. An old sea captain you never met. His name was Cornelius Whitaker. He waited 50 years to tell you a single thing, and tonight I get to tell it for him. You are worthy of a roof over your head." The boy stepped through the gate. The bell rang once behind him, soft in the fog. The fire crackled low in the hearth at 442 Briarwood Lane on that October night in 1985. The 78-year-old man in the rocking chair stopped speaking. He picked up the brass key from the side table. He turned it slowly in the firelight. His grandson Jonah, 12 years old, was sitting up straight on the rug now. His eyes were full of tears he was too proud to let fall. His knuckles were white around the cushion he had been hugging for an hour and a half. "Grandpa," he whispered, "what happened to Archie and great-grandma Maggie and the boy at the gate. Walter Ashby smiled. The smile was the smile of an old man looking at a grandson and seeing for one moment the whole long parade of years. Archie lived with me here for 19 more years, son. He died in the autumn of 1944. He was 64 years old. He was buried with full military honors at the Ocean View Cemetery on the hill. His grave faces the sea. He always loved the sea, even with one leg. Your great-grandmother, Maggie, lived with me here for 23 years. She never forgave herself completely, but she lived well. She taught hundreds of boys to read. She died in my arms in 1948. Her last word was the name of your great-grandfather Bennett. Edmund Thornwood died of a heart attack in 1939. He was buried beside his brother Charles at his own request. He told me once that love does not see its own faults. He was the kindest man I ever knew. And the boy at the gate. Walter's eyes grew wet, and he did not bother to hide it. His name was Thomas Riley. He stayed at this house for 2 years. He learned to build chairs from Archie. He learned to read from your great-grandmother Maggie. He left this house in the spring of 1928 to take a job at the Astoria Salmon Cannery. He married a girl named Lucy Hayes. They had a daughter. Walter set the brass key into Jonah's small hand and closed the boy's fingers around it. That daughter, Jonah, married a young man who came up this hill in the summer of 1950 looking for work. He had no family. He had no people. We took him in. He stayed. He fell in love with Thomas Riley's daughter, and they were married on the porch of this house in 1953. He took the Ashby name in honor of the place that had given him a home. That young man is your grandfather on your father's side. Your father is his son. The Ashby name has nothing to do with Whitaker blood Jonah. It has to do with whoever opened the door. Jonah looked down at the key in his hand. The brass was warm now from his grandfather's palm. The boy could not speak. Walter pulled the wool blanket off his lap. He stood up slowly. His back was bent. His knees creaked. But his eyes were clear. He gestured to the front door. Walk with me, son. The two of them stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The fog had thickened. The Tillamook rock light blinked very faintly across the water. A wind chime that Walter had hung in the eaves on the day Maggie had moved in 60 years before made its small, soft music. The sound had not changed in all that time. Walter rested both hands on the cedar railing. He breathed in the salt air the way only old men by the sea know how to breathe. Jonah, listen to me carefully now. The key in your hand opens this front door. When I am gone, this house belongs to you. But there is one rule. You must promise me in front of Chum and the ocean. The boy's voice was very small. What rule, Grandpa? Walter turned his face to the boy. You must never lock this door at night. Not ever. Because somewhere out there in the rain tonight, there is a child who is wet and hungry and cold. A child who has been thrown out by people who should have loved him. That child must be able to walk up the lane and turn the handle and walk inside, without knocking, without paying, without explaining. Do you hear me, son? Jonah Ashby closed his fingers tight around the brass key. I hear you, Grandpa. Walter laid one weathered hand on the boy's head. There is an old saying that I have made up myself over a long life. Gold can buy a great many things, but only kindness can buy a home. Your great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Whitaker, spent 40 years building a fortress to keep the world out. He died alone and bitter. I tore the walls down, I sold the gold, and I built a door that does not close. That is the only inheritance worth leaving. The old man and the boy stood on the porch in the fog for a long, quiet time. The chimes sang in the eaves. The lighthouse blinked. Somewhere down the lane, a soft step sounded on the gravel. A figure was walking up the hill out of the dark. A small figure, wet shoulders, thin coat. Walter could not yet see the face, but he had seen the silhouette many thousands of times in 60 years. He laid the brass key gently into Jonah's hand. "Go on, son, open the door for him." Jonah walked down the porch steps. He went through the gate. He met the figure halfway down the lane. He led him back. He turned the handle of the front door of 442 Briarwood Lane. He pushed the door open into the warm light. The wind chimes sang. The fire in the hearth threw its slow gold across the hallway floor. And inside the old Victorian house, where a one-eyed sea captain's vault had once held a fortune in Denver gold, where a homeless boy had once stood with a Colt pistol pointed at his heart, a stranger walked in from the rain. He set down his bag in the front hall. He took off his wet hat. He looked up at the cedar sign above the door. Then, because he could not think of anything else to say, he simply said the only true sentence he knew. "Thank you for the light."